He just said one name. He didn't yell. He didn't raise a fist. And for exactly 14 seconds, the United States Senate forgot how to breathe. One senator shifted. Another looked down. Even AOC, loud, confident, always ready with a retort, stayed completely still. Because in that moment, everyone in the room realized they weren't just debating a bill, they were sitting on top of a lie. J.D. Vance didn't bring a protest. He brought a list. 42 flagged investments connected to 8 people with direct influence on the very policy they claimed would save the planet. It wasn't just a challenge. It was a surgical strike. On the silence, on the show, and on the story America had been fed. And the most unsettling part? He didn't do it for power. He did it because one factory worker in Ohio asked him a simple question. Are we really just numbers to them? This story didn't happen exactly the way we'll tell it. But the feeling? The fear of being overlooked. The weight of decisions made in rooms we'll never enter. The silence after the truth lands. That part is real. What follows is a dramatization. But in a world that hides behind talking points and polished headlines, sometimes fiction becomes the last honest way to speak. So ask yourself, what kind of name makes the most powerful room in America go silent? And more importantly, why were they so afraid you'd hear it? Stay with us. You won't believe who's been sitting behind the curtain. It was nearly 1:17 a.m. when the email hit J.D. Vance's encrypted inbox. Not his public Senate address, but the dark line one. The one only 2 people on staff even knew existed. He was alone in his office, jacket off, tie loosened, sleeves rolled, the glow of his monitor painting deep shadows across the wood-paneled room. He hadn't planned to stay late, but something about the day had unsettled him. The forced applause during the Energy Committee hearing, the way AOC deflected questions not with facts but with fire, and how 3 senators who'd once opposed the Green New Deal were now suddenly evangelists. He thought he was the only one noticing the cracks, until the subject line appeared, GND pre-trades, eyes only. He paused, then clicked. No message, no greeting, no warning, just one attachment, a spreadsheet, password protected but not military grade, just enough to keep out reporters. He typed in a standard decrypt key. The file opened, his eyes narrowed, rows, columns, dollar signs, names, dates, all before the first public draft of the Green New Deal. He scrolled. 4 weeks before the bill's release, a cluster of green tech companies, mostly obscure, saw sudden bursts of insider purchases. Political action committees, consulting firms, family trusts. Then the names. Not direct senators. No, that would be too obvious. Staffers, spouses, former chiefs of staff now working as independent advisors. One name made him stop breathing for half a second. Not because he didn't expect it, but because deep down he did. His hands trembled slightly. He reached for a pen. On the corner of a legal pad, he scribbled, "How early did they know?" And then the final line of the message. Plain text, no formatting, placed in the metadata field like a whisper inside a locked box. They knew before America did. He leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. This wasn't just a leak. This was an accusation, a breadcrumb, and whoever sent it knew exactly where to drop it. He clicked to check the sender. Untraceable, rerouted through a dozen dummy servers, but one domain stood out, an old congressional subdomain that had been shut down 5 years ago. He leaned in closer. It wasn't just encrypted, it was recycled. Someone wanted him to find this, but not too easily. Someone wanted him curious, not careless. He opened the office drawer and pulled out an old flip phone, his burner. He typed one message to his chief of staff. Do not forward, do not print. I'll brief you in person. He closed the laptop slowly, locked it in the fireproof case under his desk, then sat in the silence again. Listening. Somewhere in the hallway the elevator dinged. He didn't move, because this wasn't just about policy anymore. It wasn't even about politics. It was about something older, dirtier, quieter. And someone, somewhere, had just pushed J.D. Vance into a game he wasn't supposed to play, but might be the only one willing to finish. And as J.D. stared at the names glowing on that cold spreadsheet, one face came back clearer than the rest. A factory worker with tired eyes and a quiet plea that still echoed in his conscience. The silence in JD's office lingered long after the screen went dark. He sat motionless, hands still resting on the sealed fireproof case beneath his desk. Outside, the Capitol was hushed. But inside his mind, one voice spoke louder than any encrypted file. It wasn't the sender. It was Hank, 4 months earlier, a cold, wind-bitten morning in Youngstown, Ohio. The kind of town that had once roared with steel and Union chants. Now it barely hummed. JD had visited the shuttered factory alone. No cameras, no staffers. Just a clipboard, a flannel shirt, and boots still stained with the mud from East Palestine. He wanted to walk the floor, even if the machines were long gone. He remembered the crunch of gravel under his feet, the rust flakes clinging to the old chain-link fence, the quiet ache in the air that smelled faintly of engine oil and memory. A group of former workers had gathered by the gate. None of them asked for selfies. One of them, Hank, stepped forward, mid-50s, weathered hands, hard jaw, wore his dignity like a uniform no one could take from him. He didn't shake JD's hand right away, just looked him in the eye and said, "You're from here, so don't forget here." JD nodded, but Hank wasn't done. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded photo, creased, oil-smudged, torn in the corner. Two boys, maybe 10 and 12, standing in front of a beat-up Dodge truck with fishing rods in hand. "These are my sons," Hank said. "They don't need promises of wind farms or coding boot camps. They need to see me work again. I don't care if it's steel, solar, or shoveling coal. Just don't let them think their dad stopped mattering when the paperwork changed. Promise me," he said quietly. "Promise me we're not just numbers to them." JD didn't answer right away. He couldn't. He looked at the boys in the picture, then at Hank, then at the broken smokestack in the distance. Still standing, still there, like it was waiting for someone to remember what it used to mean. "I promise," JD had finally said. But something in Hank's face made it clear. Promises meant nothing if they didn't echo when no one else was listening. Back in his office now, JD opened the drawer and pulled out the same photo. Hank had insisted he take it. "Keep it," he said, "until they prove we're not invisible." JD had kept it tucked beneath a manila folder marked Calm, Clean Transition Policy. Now that folder sat open, and the spreadsheet from the midnight message sat beside it. Hank's sons were smiling in the photo, and JD couldn't stop thinking. How do I tell them their father wasn't invisible? He was erased. He stood up slowly, walked to the window. Washington looked polished from up here, but JD knew better. Somewhere between the gleam of Capitol Hill and the quiet of Youngstown was a transaction no one wanted exposed. And that spreadsheet, that one whispered name, was no longer just a clue. It was a reckoning, and it had a face. The next morning, JD arrived at the Capitol before the sun did. The photo of Hank's boys remained in his pocket, folded warm against the fabric, like a weight, not heavy but present, like a reminder he couldn't misplace. He didn't say much during the morning briefing, just sat at the end of the conference table, flipping through the same spreadsheet from the night before, eyes scanning names like someone reading a list of the unburied. Across from him, his staffers waited. They were used to his silences, but not this one. "Pull everything you can on these names," he said finally, tapping the list. "Quietly. Backgrounds, known affiliations, donations. I want dates, patterns, trails." One aide leaned in. "Senator, some of these are just spouses or cousins, shell companies. Do we even know if—" "We don't assume," JD cut in. "We confirm. No leaks, no theories. If this is what I think it is, it's not a political problem. It's systemic." He stood up, walked over to the whiteboard, and wrote 3 words in sharp black marker. They knew before. Then he underlined new. The staff got to work. Quiet tapping on keyboards, low murmurs, the smell of burnt coffee. JD watched it all without a word. He wasn't just looking for names. He was looking for a pattern, a pulse, a plan. Because people don't just gamble millions on obscure green tech startups a month before landmark legislation, unless someone whispered first. 2 hours later, one of his legislative aides, Kara, looked up from her screen, pale. "Sir," she said, You're going to want to see this." She turned the monitor toward him. JD leaned in. There it was, a senior policy aide to AOC, still on staff, still active. But 4 weeks before the Green New Deal was introduced to the public, his sister, under her married name, had purchased $2.3 million in stock across 3 separate green energy funds. One of those funds had jumped 280% in value within 48 hours of the bill's release. JD didn't blink. The room fell completely silent. He walked slowly back to the whiteboard, picked up the marker, and, beneath "they knew before," wrote a second line. "Now we do." Someone exhaled. Another checked the hallway door. JD turned to his team. His voice was low but sharp. "We don't leak this, not to press, not to PACs, not even to our own donors. We build it. Document everything, double source it, keep it off shared servers. Print nothing unless I say so. We build a case, not a scandal. And when we move right." He let that hang in the room. No one dared speak. Outside, the hill buzzed with its usual noise. Cameras flashing, sound bites spinning, headlines being shaped before facts could catch up. But inside JD's office, something else had begun. It wasn't partisan. It wasn't personal. It was a pulse, faint but undeniable, of something bigger. Not just a name, not just a scandal, a breach. A system-wide failure where the people meant to serve had become the ones placing bets before the race even started. JD looked again at the spreadsheet, then at the photo of Hank's sons, still peeking out from under his folder. They didn't know this world existed, but they were paying for it. And now JD was going to make sure someone else did too. The headlines hadn't even cooled from the night before, and already the Capitol Rotunda was filling with reporters. Outside JD Vance's office, the news cycle spun like a carousel on overdrive. Banners flashing phrases like "Green Hope surges" and "AOC leads a new climate charge." Inside, JD sat motionless, staring at the whiteboard where 2 phrases remained. They knew before. Now we do. He didn't need to remind himself what was at stake. The file was still secure, the connection still raw, the timeline still unraveling. But out there, on the Senate floor, the show had begun. C-SPAN cameras tracked every step as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez took the podium. She wore confidence like armor. JD watched from the back bench, arms folded, tie loosened slightly. The room dimmed as spotlights flared and lenses adjusted. Not for him, never for him, but for the star everyone had come to see. Her voice rang out, sharp and soaring. "This is our moon landing," AOC declared, her eyes fierce. "A once-in-a-generation chance to save not only our planet, but our dignity." Applause followed, rhythmic, performative, perfectly timed for the next morning's political talk shows. JD didn't join in. She continued, walking the floor with practiced conviction. She quoted Roosevelt, Kennedy, even Tesla. She painted futures of clean skies, green jobs, reborn cities. Charts appeared on giant screens behind her, colorful infographics, economic projections wrapped in optimism. The chamber ate it up. Even those who had once opposed her now leaned forward, nodding carefully. Senators who had received the same donations sat in the same closed-door briefings. They had learned. When the cameras roll, it pays to look progressive. But JD wasn't looking at the charts. He was watching her eyes. They didn't flicker. Not once. Not when she mentioned accountability. Not when she promised complete transparency. Not when she said, "The Green New Deal will lift everyone, not just a few hedge funds and headline chasers." JD blinked. Just once. No one else in that room knew that he had in his possession a document that, if verified, could crack the very foundation she was standing on. But he wasn't ready. Not yet. He wasn't building a moment. He was building a case, and today was hers. As applause rose again, AOC raised her chin slightly. The camera caught her in perfect light. A congressional photographer clicked 3 frames in quick succession. JD knew those shots would be on magazine covers by Friday. He looked away, because behind every quote, every clean policy draft, and every standing ovation, he had started to see something else. the shadow of coordination, the scent of timing, and the silence of money moving just a little too early, a little too precisely. And beneath it all, a simple truth. The people who cheered the loudest were never the ones who paid the cost. He stood up quietly, slipping out of the chamber before the final applause. Outside, the cold morning sunlight hit the marble like judgment. He didn't have a spotlight. He had something heavier. Proof. J.D. Vance had barely stepped off the Senate floor before the messages started buzzing. One in particular stood out. A quiet dinner, invitation only, hosted at a discreet brick townhouse 2 blocks from the Capitol Dome. No logos, no press. Just a first name and a time. He went alone. By nightfall, the house was softly glowing from the inside. The clink of cutlery muffled beneath classical strings and murmured conversation. It wasn't a party, it was a ritual. Lobbyists in tailored suits milled quietly between rooms. Committee aides, energy analysts, former senators, ghosts of bills passed and futures already negotiated, filled their glasses with Cabernet and whispered in tones as smooth as the leather chairs. J.D. moved carefully. He wasn't here to make deals. He was here to listen. A tray passed. He took a glass, nodded to a familiar finance staffer from Delaware, and waited. Then a voice behind him. "Senator Vance, got a minute?" He turned. A man in his late 50s, sharp navy blazer, no name badge. J.D. didn't recognize the face, but he knew the type. One of the men who used to be in the room and now made money getting others into it. "Used to run mid-market strategy at Halcyon Renewables," the man said quietly, shaking J.D.'s hand. "We were the early ones, solar, offshore grid, before the big boys came in." J.D. nodded politely. "You still in the game?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Not since I asked too many questions." He leaned in slightly. The smell of mint and bourbon was faint but deliberate. "They're calling it the gold deal now," he said. "Not on paper, of course, just in the hallways that matter." J.D. didn't interrupt. The man continued softer. "It was never about carbon, never about climate. That's for the cameras. What you're watching out there," he nodded vaguely toward the Capitol, "is a resource shift. Tax credits, grants, insider bids. They're not saving the planet. They're getting rich off the idea of saving it." J.D. narrowed his eyes. "Who's they?" "Start with the names in your file," the man replied. "Then follow the committees. Energy, oversight, budget. You'll notice who stopped asking questions and started buying real estate in Aspen." A cold, clean silence settled between them. The man took a sip, then added, "I've seen this before. .com, boom, housing bubble. This one's just green-colored and gift-wrapped in hope." J.D. glanced around the room. Every face was smiling, every deal already done. "You gonna blow it open?" the man asked. "Not yet," J.D. replied. The man nodded, approving. "Then maybe there's still time to do it right." With that, he slipped away into the velvet shadows of the room, vanishing like he'd never been there. J.D. lingered at the window. Outside, traffic hummed past in polite ignorance. Somewhere across town, AOC was likely still trending on social media. Her words about justice and renewal being clipped and captioned by influencers who would never step foot in a union hall. And yet here, just beyond the cameras, a different script was being read. He didn't need more proof. He needed more time. And if what that strategist said was true, this wasn't just about her anymore. This was bigger, more coordinated, and worse. It had already begun to look like progress to people desperate for change. He stepped away from the window and quietly made his exit. No handshake, no dessert, no deal. Just a man walking into the cold night with something heavier than doubt. He had a name for it now. The gold deal. The morning after the dinner, the sunlight poured into J.D. Vance's Senate office. But it didn't feel like daylight. It felt surgical, bright, cold, and revealing. No coffee, no chit-chat. His staff already knew what kind of day it was. Aid number 1. We pulled trade logs from the 3 funds flagged in the GND pre-trades file. J.D. leaned over the table where they taped up sheets of paper into a sprawling grid. Tickers, timestamps, initials, amounts. A makeshift war room. Aid number 2. We cross-checked donors linked to the Green New Deal's early rollout. Super PACs, environmental lobbies, even boutique law firms listed as consultants. Look, she circled 3 trades on the timeline, all made within 72 hours of the closed-door briefing on federal green infrastructure grants, 2 months before the bill was public. JD didn't blink. Show me ownership structures? Aide number 3 wheeled in a whiteboard. Same trust names keep appearing. Arbor Lane Holdings, Valley Gate, and Marjorie Ventures LLC. Shells, but we dug deeper. Look who set them up. She clicked her laptop. Up popped names. JD felt his jaw tighten. Former legislative director, a former Treasury policy analyst, and the last one, a campaign co-chair who'd quietly shifted to green lobbying 6 months ago. He scanned the room. An AOC senior aide. We found a deposit pattern into a family trust that matches the value of a key options contract, dated before the climate rollout. The room went still. No one dared say what they were thinking. JD turned away from the board for a moment, gathering it all. Not just impropriety, timing, not just greed, intention, not just guesses, proof taking shape. He spoke low but firm. We're not throwing darts. We build the board, names, timeline, motives. He picked up a red marker and began drawing links, one circle at a time. The map of a political network dressed in climate rhetoric and fueled by private leverage. This isn't just about who got rich, he continued. It's about how they hijacked hope, how they sold working-class promises for stock positions. He paused. This is theft, but it's not happening in back alleys. It's happening in press releases and floor speeches. Another aide, a quiet one from Dayton, spoke up. So what do we do with it? JD capped the red marker and stepped back. We do it right. We do it clean. No leaks, no showboating. If we move too soon, it'll look like politics. If we wait too long, they'll bury it. He looked at the room, young, overworked, but burning. Start cross-referencing all the committee briefings tied to climate appropriations. Compare the timestamps with every trade we've got. Pull public hearing footage, too. Let's see who walked into the room before the rest of America knew what was coming. An aide raised a brow. You're building a prosecution case. JD didn't flinch. I'm building clarity. He turned to the window, Capitol Dome gleaming in the winter sun. Somewhere across town, there were probably meetings being scheduled right now to manage the next week's news cycle, the next headline, the next performance. But this story, they wouldn't be able to script this one. Not when it came from inside the data. Not when the trades themselves whispered betrayal. He turned back to the board, his war map of influence disguised as reform, and added one more note at the center. They knew before America did. It arrived just after sunrise. A courier in a plain black jacket walked past the front desk, said nothing, and left a small brown envelope at the front security station of J.D. Vance's office. No ID, no badge, just one scribbled label on the back. To JFE URGENT. The receptionist, confused, held it up as J.D. passed through the hallway. Something about it, the weight, the silence around it, made him stop mid-step. He opened it on the spot. Inside, a silver flash drive. Nothing else. No note, no initials, no threat. But when his aide plugged it in, the contents loaded like a trap door opening beneath their feet. A series of folders, dated memos, some marked confidential, others eyes only. They weren't just summaries. They were strategy drafts, from think tanks, from lobbyists, from internal campaign briefings. The earliest was dated 7 days before the Green New Deal bill was ever introduced in the House. JD leaned closer. The titles hit like falling dominoes. Q1 positioning, asset mapping before legislative push, private equity alignment, timeline suggestions, messaging sync, avoiding blowback in Midwest districts. Then came the bomb, a scanned meeting note, handwritten, sloppy but rushed, real. It read, target early positions in solar and water infrastructure, major equity reorg planned, likely passage via proxy language, think tank support locked in, green optics crucial, quiet coordination, avoid public floor fireworks. JD read it twice, then again. It wasn't just a plan. It was premeditated manipulation. A month ago, they were guessing. A week ago, they were cross-checking trades. Now, the curtain wasn't just pulled back. It had been ripped off the hinges. He looked around at his staff. This isn't a pattern anymore. This is an operation. One aide whispered, "Should we alert oversight?" JD shook his head. Not yet. He pulled the flash drive from the computer and pocketed it like it was a weapon. Because that's what it was now. Proof that the story they were chasing wasn't a coincidence. It was a blueprint, drafted and dated before America ever got a vote. "And this part?" another aide asked, pointing to the note about avoiding public floor fireworks. JD's eyes narrowed. "They knew how to make it look clean," he said. "That's why we have to make it look real." He stepped away from the screen, but something in his chest stayed clenched. Because whoever dropped that flash drive didn't just want the truth exposed. They wanted JD to be the one to do it, which meant the spotlight was coming. And so was the backlash. But before either arrived, he knew what had to happen. They would build the timeline wider, deeper, cross the wires of influence and profit and policy. And when it all came together, it wouldn't be about catching someone in a lie. It would be about showing America who had never been honest to begin with. And at the center of it all, beneath every briefing, buried inside every memo, was one question that refused to stay quiet. Who knew what and when? JD sat alone in a quiet Capitol Hill cafe that hadn't seen cameras in years. It was the kind of place aides whispered about, a forgotten corner where real conversations happened off the record. Across from him sat a woman in her early 40s, coat zipped high, fingers trembling slightly as she stirred a cup of untouched tea. She hadn't spoken much since she arrived, but when she finally did, her voice didn't shake. It cracked. "My name doesn't go anywhere," she said. JD nodded. Not a word. She looked him straight in the eyes. "I was a senior modeling analyst, energy projections team. I resigned 3 months ago. You're asking the right questions, but you're still 2 steps behind." She pulled out a folded paper from her bag, slid it across the table with fingers that lingered just a little too long. JD opened it gently. A termination letter, dry language, cold formatting. But one thing screamed louder than any paragraph. The date. It was issued 24 hours before the Green New Deal was introduced on the floor. "They told me the department was being reorganized," she said, "but they didn't cut anyone else. Just me." JD looked up. "Because you refused to go along." She nodded. "There was a meeting in D.C., early, weeks before anything was official. They walked through projected winners in solar infrastructure, rare earths, carbon credits. But it wasn't policy talk. It was portfolios, investment sequencing, timing drops. The language was precise." She paused. They weren't guessing. They weren't reacting. It was choreographed, like a stage play. And the clock only moved when they needed it to. JD leaned in, lowering his voice. "An AOC's office?" "I never saw direct communication," she said carefully. "But we received edits on our models from an outside consultant who's now working on her climate task force. The same models used to justify funding streams." JD exhaled. "So the data was bent before the vote." She nodded again. "Numbers don't lie, but the people who choose which ones to show do." Outside, traffic passed as if none of this mattered, but inside, a line had just been crossed. JD stared at the termination letter again. That date, one day before the country thought the idea had even gone public. "It's like a broken clock," he said quietly. "Everything looks real until you realize the hands were set manually." She gave a tired smile. "Exactly." He wanted to ask more, names, dates, emails, but the fatigue in her eyes stopped him. She hadn't come to burn the house down. She'd already been inside when it caught fire. "I'm not the only one," she added before leaving, "but most of them won't talk. Too scared. Or too paid." As she rose and disappeared down the sidewalk, JD sat motionless. The noise of the city returned, but it felt distant. What she'd given him wasn't just confirmation. It was cost. Proof that someone had already lost everything for telling the truth. And that meant the next move wouldn't be about documents or files anymore. It would be about consequences. Because if one analyst could be erased just for hesitating, What would happen to the man who pulled back the curtain? JD didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office, jacket slung across the chair, coffee going cold. The analyst's letter lay beside his laptop, but it was something else on the screen that had his eyes frozen. A follow-up file had arrived just before midnight. No subject line, no name, just a single attachment labeled Deal MAJORS Secondary. It looked like a budget addendum at first, tables, timelines, and footnotes. But then JD spotted the redacted entries, long columns of blacked-out investor names, each tied to major green tech startups listed for congressional subsidy consideration. One file stood out: Green Core Industries, a battery recycling company set to receive over $400 million in public-private funding through the Green New Deal's Phase 3 rollout. But the largest early investor? A Cayman-based holding firm named Leviathan Energy Fund. JD's aide, Eli, leaned over his shoulder. That name sound familiar to you? JD didn't answer. He clicked deeper. The Leviathan Fund traced by a spiderweb of shell corporations, back to a consortium of foreign investors. Not just any foreign investors. State-linked entities from countries currently negotiating green trade deals with the U.S. He whispered it without meaning to. This isn't a policy scam. Eli looked at him. Then what is it? JD leaned back in his chair, the air thick. It's a global con with an American flag wrapped around the invoice. For a moment, no one spoke. The room was dim except for the glow of the screen and the quiet hum of traffic outside Constitution Avenue. JD clicked open one more page, a confidential side memo buried in the file's metadata. It had been written in legalese, but the subtext was unmistakable. It described a risk-managed capital inflow from non-domestic green transition allies using obfuscated conduits to avoid regulatory friction. Translation: they were laundering foreign influence through clean energy. They're not just betting on the green economy, JD said. They're designing it for profit, not policy. Eli exhaled slowly. And they're hiding it behind the most emotionally loaded legislation in a generation. JD's jaw tightened. The Green New Deal had inspired millions, students, parents, entire communities desperate for cleaner air and a future not boiled in corporate greed. But this was cynicism in its purest form. Hope weaponized as cover. We go public? Eli asked, but he already knew the answer. Not yet, JD said, scanning the list of backers again. One name made his stomach drop. We need to know how deep this runs. This isn't just legislation anymore. It's a market coup. He clicked print. Within moments, papers began sliding out of the office printer. Line after line of entities and transactions disguised as sustainability. Eli started pinning sheets to the wall. We're going to need more string. JD cracked the ghost of a smile, but his eyes were locked on the last name at the bottom of the list. A former congressional staffer turned climate consultant, and someone JD had personally seen at the fundraiser AOC headline 2 weeks ago. Make no mistake, JD said, his voice low. They're all in on this. Not just the money, the optics, the press, the playbook, everything. And what do we do? JD stared at the wall, where the timelines and funding chains were beginning to resemble something darker than policy, something orchestrated. We don't leak, he said firmly. We don't grandstand. We build the case, quietly, completely. And when it's time, he turned toward the Capitol, just visible through the window, lit like a stage no one was watching. We say the part no one wants to hear, loud. The lights in the hearing room were always harsh, but today they felt hotter, brighter. JD Vance sat still as the technician clipped the microphone to his lapel. His staff had prepped him for days, but the real preparation, the timeline, the board, the silent dots that finally connected, had been months in the making. C-SPAN cameras rolled. Every major network's live stream banner was blinking live in red. It wasn't just another oversight committee hearing. This was theater, and JD knew exactly what act he had stepped into. AOC sat 2 chairs to his left, her notes neatly stacked, blazer crisp, hair perfectly styled for the moment. She was calm, composed, unflinching, at least for now. JD leaned forward, clearing his throat. his voice measured but carrying through every corner of the room. "Mr. Chair," he began, "I'd like to direct attention to a sequence of trades made in the 3 weeks leading up to the introduction of the Green New Deal's third appropriations clause." Whispers began instantly, staffers shifting, reporters typing, heads turning. "Specifically," JD continued, "a cluster of green energy startups that saw multi-million-dollar investments from firms with known proximity to this chamber, some even tied to former staff." He placed a stack of documents on the table with a distinct, deliberate thud. "In the spirit of transparency, I've attached a timeline, one that shows how money moved faster than policy, and how, coincidentally, those investments were positioned to benefit from specific legislative language, before that language was even public." He let the words hang. AOC shifted slightly in her seat, not enough to be noticed by most, but JD saw it, the subtle repositioning of someone calculating her next move. "Senator Vance," she interrupted, keeping her tone steady, "if this is a veiled accusation, I'd encourage you to be direct. Otherwise, you risk turning this hearing into political theater." JD smiled politely. "No veil, Congresswoman. Just facts, and a few questions. Starting with this." He held up a copy of a think tank memo, one of the documents from the anonymous drop. "This document outlines projected equity gains tied to legislative phases of the Green New Deal, dated 7 days before its official release." He turned to the chair. "May I ask if Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez was aware of this memo, or has any knowledge of the consultant whose recommendations mirror the bill's eventual structure?" The room was silent. AOC's expression held firm, but a flicker of tension crept across her jawline. "I'm not sure what this has to do with oversight, Senator. The Green New Deal was written by a coalition of experts over months." JD nodded. "Yes, and many of those experts later became lobbyists for firms receiving government contracts, some before the ink even dried." A ripple passed through the room. He leaned in, voice low but audible. "So I'll ask again. Are we debating climate policy, or are we documenting the most elegant insider trading scheme in modern history?" Murmurs turned into shuffling. AOC opened her mouth, but no words came. Just a pause long enough for the moment to freeze. Long enough for every American watching to ask the same thing JD had just asked, silently to themselves. JD didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply closed the folder and said, "The American people deserve to know if their future is being brokered behind closed doors or sold before it ever arrives." And then he sat back. The hearing continued, but the room had changed. So had the stakes. The murmurs hadn't stopped since JD sat back in his seat. Staffers typed rapidly, and social media lit up like a fuse on dry tinder. But JD didn't glance at the screens. His eyes stayed fixed on the folder in front of him. 1 page left. 1 letter. With the room still tense from his confrontation with AOC, JD reached down slowly and pulled out a worn, creased envelope. It looked out of place amid the polished binders and glossy briefings. And that was exactly the point. "Before we move on," JD said, his voice quieter now, "I'd like to read something." He unfolded the paper carefully, smoothing it across the desk. "This is a letter I received from a man named Hank Whitlow. He worked at the shuttered plant in Youngstown, Ohio. Lost his job when the promise of a greener economy didn't quite reach his zip code." He began to read, his voice even, but waited. "Dear Senator Vance, I heard the speeches. I saw the ads. You said we'd be part of this future. But today my boys are watching me sell off my tools to pay the heating bill. You said it's a green future. We got gray skies and no job. I don't know if I'm supposed to be hopeful or just quiet, but I wanted someone to know I was here." JD lowered the letter slowly. The room had gone silent again, but not from shock. This time, it was something heavier. No one moved. Even the cameramen seemed to hold their breath. AOC shifted. Then she leaned forward, hands clasped, and spoke, carefully. "Respectfully, Senator, this sounds like fear-mongering. We cannot allow isolated cases of economic hardship to derail transformative progress. This country has always gone through growing pains in the pursuit of something better." JD looked directly at her. "That man's fear," he said, measured and cold, "fed your portfolio. A gasp escaped from someone in the audience. AOC's mouth tightened. That's a deeply unfair accusation. I have no financial stake in. JD cut in, not with volume, but with precision. Then answer the worker, not the camera. He let the silence work again. Tell him why his community was left off the blueprint. Tell him how a policy meant to uplift forgot to check if the ground was even. And tell him, while we're at it, why every firm that backed your bill had already bought the land his factory sat on. AOC opened her mouth again, but JD raised the letter. Hank doesn't need a rebuttal. He needs a reason to believe that Washington still hears him. He folded the page slowly and placed it back in his folder. This hearing isn't about villainizing ideas. It's about remembering whose names don't get printed in the press releases, whose lives don't trend. He sat back, his tone flat. I yield my time. For a moment, it felt like nothing moved. The hearing chair cleared his throat, trying to regain control. But JD didn't notice. His eyes drifted up, not toward the cameras, but to the empty seat in the back row. That was where Hank had planned to sit. But travel from Youngstown wasn't cheap these days, and some truths don't need the person present to land. The gavel fell with a muted thud. The hearing was over, but the silence that followed felt less like closure and more like anticipation. Staffers began to shuffle papers, unhook microphones, and file toward the exits. Cameras cut, lights dimmed, and for a few fleeting seconds, it felt like everything might go back to normal. But the microphone on the chairman's desk was still live, and someone forgot to cut the feed to the auxiliary press pool. A senator's voice slipped through, low, casual, not meant for public ears. Why didn't they bury this earlier? 9 seconds. That was all. 9 seconds of unfiltered, unintended clarity. The clip hit Twitter 20 minutes later. By the end of the hour, it had 1.3 million views. By dawn, the hashtags were trending globally. Hashtag what did they bury? Hashtag Mickgate. Hashtag green gold cable news replayed the moment in endless loops, zooming in on the lip movements, speculating on who said it, why they said it, and, most importantly, what this referred to. JD didn't post anything. He didn't need to. He stood at his window in the Senate office, coffee going cold in his hand, as text after text rolled in. Reporters, veterans, Hill aides, and one message from Hank's oldest son. He would have smiled watching this. JD exhaled slowly, but victory didn't taste like it should. Not yet, because now came the flood. Across the country, morning shows debated the hearing not as policy, but as theater. AOC's allies claimed intentional sabotage. Her critics accused her of dodging working-class concerns. And everywhere, people kept asking one thing. What don't we know? JD's staff gathered in the briefing room by noon. The energy had shifted from cautious investigation to public readiness. The timeline board, once hidden in the corner, now sat center stage. Names circled in red, arrows threading transactions, locations, dates. He turned to his team. We no longer own this story, he said. America does. But the job's not done. He tapped the board twice. This is about more than hypocrisy or timing. It's about credibility. If even one of these lines crosses into corruption, we go all the way. A young staffer hesitated. And if it leads somewhere darker? JD didn't blink. Then we don't stop at the first door. Outside the Capitol lawn had reporters waiting, hungry for quotes. But JD didn't head down. Instead, he sat at his desk and replayed the hearing clip one more time. Not the broadcast, the raw feed. He watched AOC's face as the letter was read. He paused on the moment her eyes darted, not in anger, but recognition. There was something there, a shift, and he wasn't done chasing it. As the video looped again, a new email popped up. No subject, no signature. Just one line. That wasn't the only mic they forgot. The Capitol office was silent, save for the low hum of the overhead lights. JD stood in front of a massive corkboard pinned with a U.S. map. States color-coded, counties marked, towns labeled in fine black ink. But it wasn't the base map that told the story. It was the red circles, 48 of them. Each one a plant shuttered within months of the Green New Deal's rollout, not because the industries were obsolete, but because funding streams quietly redirected elsewhere. Solar contracts that bypassed union shops, wind consortiums that favored coastal contractors, incentives that excluded legacy manufacturing towns. He stepped back, arms crossed, and let the pattern hit him. Ohio, Indiana, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Kentucky. Circles clustered like wounds. He picked up a sticky note from the table beside him, written in his own handwriting the night before. What's green for some turned red for everyone else. He pressed the note to the corner of the board. Behind him, his policy lead, Kara, walked in with a spreadsheet. We confirmed 32 of the closures happened within 6 weeks of preliminary G&D briefings to the private sector. 26 towns lost over half their local job base. JD didn't turn. Draw the timeline again. This time overlay the PAC contributions. Kara's fingers paused on the keyboard. You think this is the line that connects it all? He nodded. Not just think, I feel it. He tapped one circle in West Virginia. This plant ran 20-hour shifts for 3 decades. 1 month after the G&D passed, funding was reprioritized. 2 weeks later, they laid off 1,200 people and the town's grocery store closed. Not politics. That's a family's dinner gone. Kara's eyes flicked to the board. You're going to use this in the floor session? JD gave a short nod. No names, just facts. Because facts, he paused. Facts aren't afraid of cameras. The room fell still. He turned and scanned the rest of the board, fingers trailing across the circles like counting scars. Every dot represented lives upended, homes foreclosed, graduation gowns never bought, medicine skipped. These weren't numbers. They were signals. Red warning flares the media ignored. And now, the country was finally looking. From behind him, his press secretary poked her head in. Senator, you've got 5 minutes before the radio hit. They're asking about the Mickgate fallout. He glanced once more at the map. Tell them I'm not talking about microphones, he said. I'm talking about megaphones. And I plan to hand one to every town they tried to erase. As she left, Kara stepped closer to the board. You think this leads back to her? JD's eyes locked on the Midwest. I think it leads back to everyone who smiled while writing checks. A second later, he picked up a Sharpie and added a red circle to a town in Iowa. Small, unnoticed, recently listed in a footnote. It made 49, and they weren't done counting. JD was still staring at the map when Kara re-entered, her face pale. There's more, she said quietly, holding a thin, stapled packet. It's from within Evergreen Holdings, the largest private backer of post-G&D solar developments. He took it silently, flipped through the pages. On page 3, the words stopped him cold. Midwestern Corridor designated as LRRZ, Low Resistance Restructuring Zones. He reread it. Once. Twice. Then his hand clenched the edge of the paper until it crumpled. They didn't even bother with code names, he muttered. They labeled people like they were outdated software. He threw the memo down on the table beside the map. Kara stayed quiet. She knew when to let him sit with it. JD paced once, then turned and pointed to a dot on the board. That's Youngstown, he said. That's where Hank gave me the photo of his boys. Told me to promise him they weren't just numbers. And now they've gone a step lower. They're zones, not even towns anymore. He walked back to the table, smoothing out the wrinkled page with slow, deliberate fingers. His voice dropped, rough with restraint. They called them zones. I call them families. Kara stepped forward. There's a follow-up slide deck attached. Talks about behavioral predictability and public sentiment lag. They expected minimal backlash, especially from rural regions. JD's laugh was bitter, hollow. Of course they did. Because they think these people don't know how to write op-eds or start podcasts. They think silence is approval. He lifted the packet and held it to the light like it might confess something more. But silence isn't approval. Sometimes it's just survival. Behind him, a new red dot blinked on the digital board. Another town, another restructuring zone. His phone buzzed, a text from a contact in the Department of Labor. 2 more facilities had filed for transitional green closure, a term that had become bureaucratic wallpaper. JD muttered the words aloud. Transitional green closure. Then with acid. Sounds like a spa. Feels like a funeral. The room was now filled with tension. Not just frustration, but moral urgency. He turned to Kara. We need to leak this, but smartly. Not just to stir noise. We build the context. We show the paper trail. We name who called them zones. Kara hesitated. It could cause a storm. JD locked eyes with her. Good. Some towns never got thunder. Let this be their lightning. As he returned to his desk, the memo still spread open, he reached for a pen. At the top of the document, above all the technical jargon and financial speak, he wrote in thick, black ink. You called it strategy. They'll remember it as abandonment. For a long moment, he didn't say anything else. The map, the memo, the silence, they all hung in the air like a prelude. And just beyond that silence, something was beginning to rise. By the time the memo had been verified and JD's team strategically leaked key pages to 3 trusted journalists, the ripple had already become a wave. Headlines shifted from glowing support for the Green New Deal to cautious scrutiny. And in just 24 hours, public trust dropped by 11%. Not in theory, not in climate hope, but in the people behind it. In Ohio, a small-town news anchor opened her 6 p.m. broadcast with just 3 words, holding up the memo JD had shared. They called us zones. In Montana, a retired steelworker reposted the clip with a caption that read, I've been unemployed for 7 months, so yeah, this hits. And in suburban Pennsylvania, a city council meeting, usually attended by a sleepy dozen, saw over 300 people show up, holding copies of job closure notices and asking, was this by design? JD watched it unfold not from a podium, but from the corner of a diner. Coffee gone cold, eyes glued to a muted TV. The anchor was now pointing to red markers on a U.S. map that looked eerily like the one on his office wall. The shift had started. That night, AOC's team responded. A polished video, fast cut, emotionally charged. The caption read, Who funds J.D. Vance? Big oil, that's who. She stared into the camera with conviction. We're trying to save the planet, and he's trying to save ExxonMobil's boardroom bonuses. Don't be fooled by fear. But something about it rang hollow. The words hit the screen, but not the people. In the diner, the man next to JD muttered, She used to talk to us. Now she talks at us. Kara texted moments later. Comments are turning, even independents. They're not buying it. JD replied with just one line, We don't gloat, we guide. The next morning, town halls from Oregon to Tennessee exploded with emotion. Mayors were shouted down. Congressional reps were booed, not because of what they had done, but what they hadn't said. One woman in tears held up her eviction notice and shouted, I believed in green jobs. I voted for this. Where's my job? Where's my green? The soundbite played across national news. JD recognized her face. It was someone from a plant visit in Iowa. She had hugged him once and said, Just don't forget us. He hadn't, and now it was clear. Neither had America. But with momentum came pressure. JD's inbox was swamped with interview requests. His aides were split. Some wanted him to go on a media blitz. But he said, no, we're not chasing cameras. We're chasing the truth. And it's not done being told. Instead, he asked for 3 things. A complete timeline of fund transfers pre-bill, a map overlay of closures with PAC donations, and a review of every public promise made in Green New Deal town halls since year 1. This isn't just one broken deal, he said quietly. It's a pattern, and patterns tell truth. AOC's camp released a second video. Angrier this time. She said JD was weaponizing fear and manipulating the working class. But that backfired too. Because for the first time in years, the working class wasn't just listening. They were speaking. And what they wanted wasn't a soundbite. They wanted answers. The air was colder this time. JD stepped out of the car and onto the cracked asphalt of what used to be the largest employer in Youngstown. The factory, once roaring with machines and lunch bell whistles, now stood like a mausoleum. Not just of labor, but of trust. Weeds pushed through concrete seams. Rust etched itself into every surface like a signature no one wanted to claim. 4 months ago, He had stood here with Hank, a man whose handshake was rougher than most leather gloves. That day, Hank handed him a photo of his two sons and asked, "Promise me we're not just numbers to them." JD hadn't forgotten. Not that question, not the weight behind it. Now he was back, but it wasn't Hank who met him. It was George, Hank's older brother, still in the same oil-stained denim jacket, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. They walked side by side across the silent floor, boots echoing like distant thunder. "No one comes back once the cameras leave," George muttered. JD didn't answer. He didn't need to. He wasn't there for cameras. George led him to a rusted break room with the vending machine still blinking, out of order. From his jacket, he pulled out a folded piece of paper. Carefully, like he was afraid it might rip the moment, he handed it to JD. "It's from Hank's boy. He left it on the kitchen table after watching the news." JD unfolded it slowly. It was written in thick, uneven pencil strokes. "Dad, are they going to bulldoze our life too? If jobs are smoke and promises are wind, how come no one hears us when we shout?" JD read it twice, then again. George looked away. "He's 10, thinks this place is his inheritance, doesn't understand why everyone talks about green futures, but forgets brown boots like his dad's." Outside, the sun began to dip behind the hollowed factory roof, casting long shadows that reached toward them like ghosts of former workers. JD walked to the far wall, the one where long ago Union flyers used to hang. Now there was only one torn remnant flapping in the breeze through a broken window. It said, "We showed up. Don't forget we were here." That night, he didn't take a car back to DC. He asked to borrow George's truck, said he needed the quiet. And as he drove through the outskirts of Youngstown, past empty diners and boarded churches, he whispered to no one in particular, "We never needed a microphone. We needed someone who actually listened." The letter stayed on the passenger seat, folded, weightless, yet heavier than anything he'd carried from Capitol Hill. Because in a city emptied by policy and polished lies, one child's question now echoed louder than any vote. "Are they going to bulldoze our life too?" And JD knew this wasn't just about corruption anymore. It was about what America does with the people it forgets, when the future becomes profitable but inconvenient. 3 days after returning from Youngstown, JD stood at the edge of a modest community center gym in Ohio, a building that once hosted high school dances and now bore the scars of neglect. Folding chairs lined the hardwood floor. A live stream camera, perched unsteadily on a tripod, blinked red. There were no sponsors, no filters, just a handheld mic and a promise. Let them speak. No one rehearsed. No one needed to. JD opened the forum with only a few words. "This isn't about politics. It's about what politics forgot." Then he stepped aside. The first man to speak was Roy, a former welding supervisor. His voice was slow, not from hesitation, but from years of being told to hurry up and move on. He didn't speak of revenge. He spoke of rhythm, the rhythm of machines now silent. "We built frames for turbines, he said. Big ones. Clean energy, they called it. We just called it pride." Next came Carla, soft-spoken, gray curls tucked under a ball cap embroidered with her union's emblem. She read from a note card held with shaking hands. "I trained 23 apprentices in my time," she said. "They closed our floor and called it progress. But progress shouldn't mean we disappear." JD watched from the back, arms folded tightly. This was not the anger cable news fed on. It was steadier, quieter, and far more dangerous. It was dignity, refusing to be erased. Then came Marisol. She walked to the mic with a steelworker's jacket tied around her waist, a photo in one hand. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. Everyone in town knew her. She was the one who organized lunch drives when the layoffs started, the one who held candlelight vigils after the suicides. She held up the photo. "My brother's name was Elias," she said. "He worked the smelter line, 26 years old. Thought green jobs were coming, thought maybe he could retrain. When he asked for help, the office told him, 'That program's not funded yet.' But the stock went up anyway." A pause. "We weren't asking for handouts," she continued, voice catching but never breaking. We were asking not to be erased. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The silence was its own indictment. JD took the mic again, not to speak, but to close. He looked toward the live stream camera, now watched by thousands across the country. People from Oregon to Georgia had tuned in not for spectacle, but because they saw themselves in every tear, every pause, every worker who stood tonight with nothing but their story and their spine. These are not headlines, JD said. These are names. He didn't promise reform. He didn't point fingers. He simply said, if you want to talk green deals, start by listening to the ones it left behind. And with that, the live stream ended. But the clip, especially Marisol's line, we weren't asking for handouts. We were asking not to be erased, spread like wildfire. The message couldn't be spun. The faces were too real. And for the first time, the narrative began to shift. Not because a politician said so, but because America heard its reflection and didn't recognize what it saw. It had been 3 days since the town hall. JD sat alone in his Senate office, the echoes of the workers' testimonies still alive in his mind. The room was dim, the early morning sun casting long amber lines across his desk. Outside the window, D.C. buzzed with its usual hollow urgency, but in here the silence was different, intentional, weighty. That's when the courier arrived. No name, no signature, just a brown unmarked envelope, sealed tightly and thick with something rigid inside. JD didn't recognize the handwriting, but as he tore it open, a faint scent of old paper and ink drifted upward. The kind only found in things meant to last. Inside a single sheet of paper, written in black pen with a slight tremble to the strokes. You were right. There's more. I couldn't stay silent anymore. Not after what I saw. Check the drive, but only when you're ready to finish this. You don't know me, but I watched everything burn from the inside. No signature, just a line at the bottom. We weren't all complicit. Some of us were just afraid. Beneath the letter was a small black USB drive, matte, worn, with only one marking scratched into it by hand. For when you're ready to finish this. JD stared at it, unmoving. He'd been in this office 1,000 nights, walked through 1,000 closed-door meetings, listened to 1,000 polished lies. But something about this moment, the quiet delivery, the handwritten letter, the finality of the tone, made the hairs on his neck rise. He turned the drive slowly in his hand. It felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than files. It carried risk. It carried truth. Possibly it carried a name that could unravel everything. He didn't plug it in immediately. Instead, he opened his drawer and retrieved the photo from Youngstown, the one Hank gave him months ago. The two boys in the picture grinned in their school uniforms, their names scribbled on the back, Ethan and Miles. JD whispered to himself, you promised him they weren't just numbers. Then he plugged in the drive. The computer screen flickered. A single folder appeared. Chainlink Room 5. Inside it, meeting transcripts from private Senate briefings, not the kind archived for public record, but the kind held off the books. Redacted names, blacked out lines, but the voice transcripts remained. JD read through line after line, discussions of market timing, foreign buy-ins, restructuring zones coordinated months before any public vote. And one name kept surfacing, always marked as S4, always giving directives, never in the room, but always referenced with a title, the Senator. His eyes narrowed. He recognized the phrasing, the cadence, the cold efficiency. It wasn't AOC. It wasn't even someone on the Green New Deal committee. It was someone older, sharper, quieter. JD leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. The real architect had never stepped in front of a microphone, never tweeted, never claimed the spotlight. And now it made sense why the file had landed here, in his hands and no one else's, because someone inside wanted this to end, but couldn't risk ending it themselves. JD reached for his phone. There would be no more slow walks, no more whispered rumors. He was ready to finish this. The buzz outside the Senate chamber was different this time. Not frantic, but expectant. No protest signs, no chants. Just a steady line of reporters, staffers, and citizens, all waiting to witness something rare. Not spectacle, but substance. J.D. Vance stepped through the chamber doors with the quiet confidence of a man who carried more than papers. In his briefcase was the drive, the transcripts, the donor trades, the think tank memos, and most importantly, the pattern, built piece by piece over months, connecting the invisible threads of profit, policy, and betrayal. As he took his seat at the committee table, his gaze swept across the room. AOC was already there, stone-faced. Two senators whispered behind their folders. A familiar staffer from the Energy Commission typed rapidly on a tablet. Cameras blinked. The air was tight. The chairman gavelled the session into order. JD didn't wait for dramatic effect. He spoke with a low, firm tone that cut through the ceremonial language like a scalpel through gauze. I've submitted in advance a timeline to every committee member. It shows the alignment between legislative drafts and private equity movements across 6 states. The timestamps aren't coincidences. The names attached are anonymous. And the motive, well, I'll let the numbers speak. He clicked a remote. On the screen, a clean chart appeared. It wasn't flashy. Just dates, trades, and policy announcements. A murmur spread as JD explained how 5 former aides, 3 from energy think tanks, 2 from congressional offices, all made suspicious investments days before sections of the Green New Deal were quietly inserted through reconciliation procedures. He didn't speculate. He cited. Then came the meeting transcripts. JD projected an excerpt on the screen. One from the Chainlink Room 5 file. Blacked out names, but the dialogue was damning. Push it through before oversight notices. S4 already guaranteed media coverage for the rollout. Delay EPA disclosure. We need time to adjust stakeholders. JD paused. That meeting happened 6 days before the bill was publicly introduced. Gasps, shuffling papers. AOC leaned forward, her jaw tight. Then he held up the envelope. This came anonymously. I won't name the sender. But inside was something else. Not just memos. Regret. He read aloud. We weren't all complicit. Some of us were just afraid. A silence fell like snow. Soft, suffocating, and impossible to ignore. JD's voice didn't rise. He didn't need to. I'm not here to destroy anyone. I'm here to stop a system that lets working families become pawns in a game they never agreed to play. When Hank gave me a photo of his kids and asked if they were just numbers, I couldn't answer. Now I can. He turned to the chairman. I formally request a bipartisan subcommittee to investigate insider coordination tied to the rollout of the Green New Deal, including financial disclosures of all senior staff connected to energy policy between 2020 and 2024. The chairman blinked, slowly, then nodded. And just like that, the room shifted. Not with applause, not with outbursts, but with something deeper, reckoning. Because for once, a hearing wasn't about political theater. It was about truth, laid out with surgical calm and undeniable clarity. Outside, the media hadn't even begun to spin. The real story was still unfolding. Not in headlines, but in the silence of powerful people realizing the curtain had just been pulled back. And JD? He didn't look satisfied. He looked ready for whatever came next. The charts were gone from the screen now. The documents had been submitted. The committee room had settled into that strange, taut stillness that only came when something irreversible had just occurred. JD closed the folder slowly, as if sealing not just paperwork, but a phase of history. Then instead of rising, he looked up and spoke again. This time not as a prosecutor, but as a son of Ohio, of steel towns and silent factories, and men who once believed that hard work would protect their children. I want to end today with one question. His voice was quieter now. No performance, no cadence, just wait. If this plan was for the people, he said, his eyes scanning the senators seated before him, then why did the people suffer first and profit last? He didn't need a chart to explain it. The audience already knew. The factory closures, the time trades, the memos, the zones, the families. He turned to AOC directly. You called this our moon landing, but the first people launched were janitors, line workers, mill welders, and single mothers. They weren't launched into hope. They were launched out of jobs. AOC didn't flinch. She sat still. Cameras lingered on her expression, searching for a reaction, outrage, defiance, rebuttal. But it didn't come, only a pause. Then softly she said, "I didn't know." It wasn't defensive. It wasn't loud. It was almost too small for the microphone. JD didn't respond right away. His gaze didn't narrow. It stayed open, steady, the way you look at someone you once respected but no longer trust with your silence. "But I think you did," he finally replied. It wasn't a zinger. It wasn't a line meant for a headline. It was something worse, or maybe better. It was belief, that quiet belief that truth doesn't need to scream to convict. That conviction, real conviction, lands not in applause but in the breathless hush that follows a truth no one else dared say. The room didn't erupt. It inhaled. In that moment, something turned. Not just politically, not just publicly, but morally. Because AOC's silence said more than any defense could have. And JD's final words didn't accuse. They revealed. The chairman cleared his throat. A procedural motion followed. But no one was listening anymore. Reporters scribbled, but their hands moved slower now. One aide in the gallery blinked back a tear. Even the cameras, which mechanical, impartial, seemed to linger longer than necessary. Outside the Capitol, the headlines were already forming. But inside, something older had happened. Something beneath politics, beneath narrative. A reckoning between ambition and consequence. Between good intentions and real harm. JD gathered his papers. Not hurried, not triumphant. Just tired. As he rose, he glanced once more toward the chair where Hank's letter had rested. The folded copy still sat beside his notes. The photo of the boys creased from being passed around. He picked it up gently, then walked out without saying another word. The hallway outside JD's office was quiet when he returned. No reporters, no staff waiting. Just the low hum of Capitol air vents and the weight of what had been said hours earlier, still hanging invisibly in the air. He stepped inside, closed the door gently and exhaled. Not with relief, but with a kind of finality. On his desk sat the envelope. The very first one. The one with the file name that had changed everything. GND_PRETRADES.XLSX. It was still there, sealed in a clear sleeve, untouched since the day his aide printed it for review. JD picked it up, brushed his thumb across the corner, then walked slowly toward the far wall, the one he had kept intentionally bare. Until now, the frame was already prepared. Solid walnut, matte glass, and beneath it a plaque carved not by machine, but by hand. A gift from a veteran craftsman back in Portsmouth who heard about the hearings and mailed it in without fanfare. JD mounted the spreadsheet carefully inside. The numbers were still sharp, the names still legible. Nothing redacted, nothing blurred, just the truth, frozen in ink and time. He stepped back and looked at it. No lights, no spotlight, just the soft amber glow of his desk lamp reaching halfway up the wall. The carved quote below read, "Transparency isn't radical. It's what we were owed from the start." He stood there for a while, arms crossed, saying nothing. In that frame wasn't just a document. It was a line in the sand, the beginning of accountability, or maybe just the refusal to forget. Because while headlines fade and polls shift and speeches dissolve into noise, there are some things that don't need repeating. They only need remembering. A quiet knock came at the door. His aide peeked in, hesitated. "Press is asking if you'll comment tonight." JD didn't turn around. "Tell them they've already heard everything worth saying." Then after a pause, "But let them come by. Let them see it for themselves." The aide nodded and left. JD remained looking at the wall. No victory lap, no champagne, just a frame, a spreadsheet, and a promise that the next time someone whispered they'll never notice, the answer would already be hanging, silent but undeniable. Sometimes truth doesn't need a microphone. It only needs a frame and someone brave enough to hang it. JD's quiet gesture wasn't about glory. It was about responsibility. In a world flooded with noise, he chose clarity. What stays with me is the silence that followed, not empty, but full of meaning. It reminds us that real change often begins after the speeches end, when the cameras are gone and integrity is all that remains. What about you? When was the last time you saw something wrong and chose to remember instead of looking away? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.